Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going well. We have two fantastic topics. Yeah. But otherwise, I don't have a lot of notes. I think the last few ones I've just said it's fall. So it remains fall, early winter.
Yeah. I guess, well, by the time this episode goes, we're still mid-fall. Everything's fine. I'm not starting to panic about winter setting in or the next few weeks of travel or anything like that. Just cool as a cucumber over here.
It's all good. I mean, this season is always, I always say it's busier than I think every year, 20 plus years of doing this. And I always think, fall is going to be, I don't know why I don't just remind myself this, but, there's athletes who are moving on, we have families starting or whatever. And then we have new athletes coming in, which is always exciting, but also busy.
Well, and I think you also are so used to Canadian winters of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where you think that you're not going to be doing any skill sessions starting in October because the weather is going to change.
It is nice, but yeah, now I have bookings into November now, which I would have never thought of. There'd be a little bit of cyclocross early September, and then no one really, the weather would start getting crummy towards the end of September, and no one would want to practice cross. And yeah, I'd just lounge about. I don't know if that was true either, but
there was no lounging.
But yeah, it's sort of these different sides of the job of the coach, which is good. It's why I love it. But yeah, it's been fun. So. Yeah, that's where we are. And you've released your book and it's going well.
Yes.
Book.
Running as fast as we can. My 11th book. It's a young adult novel. If you have not heard me talk about it already, very excited about it. So we have that. Of course, we have Misha Powell's Sprinting Through Setbacks. I'm also personally very excited about our tote bags that say read books, ride bikes, because, the shred girls are still alive and well.
Okay. And we have the merch for Consummate Athlete is on Consummate Athlete, but the bag you're speaking about is on stronggirlpublishing.com.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
But definitely check out our range of stuff over at consummateathlete.com. I don't think we talk about that often enough.
We do have a store. You can buy a training plan. You can buy a gift certificate for training plans and or skill sessions. And then you can also add on a little sweatshirt or two.
Yeah, and obviously some of it is, Consummate Athlete with our logo, but then there are some fun ones. I personally am kind of obsessed with the This Is My Rest Day sweatshirt. I think that one's a really good one for someone who's really bad at rest days.
And then we also have Cross Training is Not a Crime, I believe, on there, which is my favorite.
Yeah, so head over to consummateathlete.com/shop to check all of that out. And I think let's just get right into this question.
We have two questions today.
Okay. One is kind of this more global topic about someone who, wants to be a good cyclist, but also has no interest in being an elite cyclist, really.
So recreational cyclists, how do you bridge the gap, I think they said, between recreational cycling and competitive? Mm-hmm. Okay, and so we'll explore that.
The other one, super simple, is about decoupling, when your heart rate and your power start decoupling in their zones.
Super simple. Nothing complicated there at all. Everyone will get it.
Nope. Very easy.
Okay, which one do you want to start with?
I think we should start with the goal one here, because I think this is a really interesting one. And I think it actually can kind of lead into a reason that this heart rate power decoupling thing could be an interesting point and something to work on.
Yep, very common.
So the question was, could you address bridging the gap between leisure cycling and higher performance? How do people set goals if they're not competitively racing and have specific races they want to do? In other words, how do you bring structure into recreational riding? Biking with the purpose of aging well and improving health outcomes, what would that look like? Okay, I love this, especially the ending where it's the purpose of aging well and improving health outcomes. Because I think that's something that a lot of, I include myself when I say masters. I do think this is once you hit your 30s, there needs to be some thought towards aging well, even while trying to improve as a cyclist. This is something I was talking to a bike fitter, Wendy. I'll link to her in the show notes. I'm blanking on her last name. Apologies. Oh, Wendy Holiday. There we go. We were talking for an article on how your bike fit should change as you age. And one of the big things we started talking about is that in your 30s and 40s in particular, this is where you should really be building your strength and your mobility, which is something that we often don't think about in our 30s and 40s because we're just kind of coasting on what we have and we're still chasing our big cycling goals. But if we want to be riding strong in our 50s, 60s, beyond, we need to be, thinking about putting on muscle and, having that good mobility while we're still, young, relatively.
For sure. And that's all sorts of reasons. I think it gets, sometimes you'll hear that horror story, like you'll never build bone after 20. And you're like, what? I thought it was 25. And, but there are studies where even with people, who have gone past osteoporosis and they're like really getting low bone density and they can actually see bone built at older ages, right? So I think we're still understanding that. But that said, you would much rather build a good, strong skeleton and posture and your muscles are very strong and you have great movement ability, or you could call this like literacy, that physical literacy. So you can lift a barbell off the floor. You've seen a barbell before. It would be easier, much like it's easier to start bike riding when you're 10 or 20 than it is at 40 or 50 or 60. It's lots of examples of clients who have done this, but they will tell you that it took effort and is a little scary at times for them. So it is better to start, I think, moving in different ways and thinking about this health and longevity and mobility at the age you are now. Let's just put it that way, right? The best time to start was when you were 10 and the next best time is today, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like if you're not throwing kettlebells around and thinking about that I would say is pretty clearly a beneficial thing to do. Yeah. So I think that what that opens you up to, like, what does that mean? I think it's sort of like, well, if you don't plan to be, the 100-year-old person going for the 100-year-old record on the track, who's like curled around their handlebars and, just looks like they've sat on a bike their whole life. Like, I think that's probably what folks are getting at, right? You don't want to be at risk for hip fractures or at as much risk. You want to be a bit more resilient to walking around the rest of your day. Mm-hmm. And I think most people, that's what they would like. Like, they'd like to be able to ride their bike when they want, but they also want to be able to walk around and go on trips. And, you'll hear like, pick up my grandkids or dance with my grandkids at their wedding or something.
For sure. Yeah.
Which is hard to think about for some people, but I guess that's the idea, right?
Okay. So how does that work structurally, I guess, like especially within the recreational cycling? So I think a lot of this comes down to, how do you think about your week, your month?
Well, I mean, so first off, we definitely have in our coaching clients, the athletes we work with, and I consider these all athletes. There is the range from several who have never even raced up to, of course, the the Noahs and the elite masters we work with that are going to nationals and to worlds for masters or worlds for elite level racers, right? So there's sort of that whole spectrum. And so the athletes we work with who they always say like, oh, well, I'm not as important as, no, you're like more important. Like they're all self-motivated. They're going to do it. They're young. They'll figure it out. Right. All the goals are equal in my mind. And so those goals might be, there's sort of this like that end of the spectrum where it's no racing or a tiny bit of racing or events or tours or trips. That's what it looks like for a lot of folks, right? They're going to Europe for a week of cycling and they want to be ready for the hills. They don't want to get dropped. They want to be able to like look around and enjoy it. And
sort of how I feel right now.
Yeah, Molly's going on this trip in Europe and she wants to keep up and, look good in the photos. You don't want to look like you're slumped over the handlebars and struggling.
Harsh, but okay. Actually completely accurate.
Right. And these things are not easy. A lot of these trips are large mountains and you need to, you can get more ready, more fit for the task of doing these trips. So that's what a lot of these people, they pick a couple things in the year they're getting ready for. Some of these, it's every Saturday from May till August. I'm going to do a group ride on Saturday and I'd like to go from the C group to the B group in the group ride, or I'd like to be very good in the B group or the C group and I want to survive and be, able to chat with people. I don't want to be struggling off the back and holding people up or, there's all these goals. You can start seeing those. Those are all outcome goals in my mind where we're getting to the trip and we're finishing it. Those are outcomes, right? There's lots of variables in the same way when you say you want to win X race, it's an outcome goal. There's lots of variables, right? So then for the same thing we would look at then is, well, what are some things in training we can control? So there's the obvious, like all the aspects that you're asking about on the week and the month and the year of training hours, time up the, we can still do testing, and maybe with these clients, I'm less concerned about your maximal tests. We might do them still if they're into it, the local hill test or a 5-minute test or a 20-minute test or a 30-minute test or a 1 hour of power, whatever you want to test. But what I really like is actually what we'll talk about in this decoupling test is something like an aerobic test, or what, Phil Maffetone's MAF test is basically like this. Joe Friel has one that I think is like the aerobic threshold test or something like that. I don't recall what his is called, but you basically ride under your zone 2 limit or under 75% or under your MAF heart rate, which for most adults is like around 140 beats. And you just see how fast or how far or how many watts or all of those you can do for 30 minutes without going over that heart rate. Mm-hmm. So in running, it's pretty easy to explain. You warm up gradually till your heart rate's around this 75%, not over, but just approaching it. And then you would run. That's when the test starts, is when you're close. You would run around the track and you track the distance and then also the speed. Obviously, you pull that out for 30 minutes and you can't go over. So if your heart rate starts drifting, then you got to slow down. Some people will have to walk this whole test, right? Some people can't run under 75%. And then as they train, they can suddenly run under 75%. So that to me is like a great one when we're talking about aerobic fitness, metabolism, health, longevity. And if you read anything Phil Maffetone, that's definitely the bent that he takes you off on, right? I really like most of his stuff, but that's definitely like that world's going off more into the like health. But it looks a lot like I use that same test for my health clients, but we also have Noah doing the 75% to test aerobic capacity.
Right.
And he might do it for 60 minutes or even longer sometimes. But that's the idea. So that's what would we do? Well, we set the goal, we see what you do, and then we try to make that test better. And then we say how you're doing on the group ride and we try and make that better. And yeah, it's just training, right? It's just, we're putting a couple goals, a couple markers on the calendar for the year, trip, group ride, maybe an event of some type, and then we try and increase your training capacity in the same way we increase someone who's racing's capacity.
Yeah, and I think, the nice thing with when you're more of this recreational rider without these like very specific goals, I think is like there is more room for flexibility within the training schedule of the week. Your intervals don't have to be like quite as like perfect or specific or any of that, but there's definitely still room to have like that structured training, both from like a fun and time standpoint and from a, you can be recreational and still, want to get better.
Well, and there's this whole world of like the Peter Attia and like the people like to watch that, so that in some ways that those folks can actually get more intense about their HIIT training, their high intensity training, and their zone 2 training. They want to ride exactly at their zone 2 for 45 minutes on their indoor trainer so that it's quote unquote perfect intensity right at that limit. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Some of these folks don't want to train 15 hours a week. They want to train for 5 hours a week, and they want me to make them as fit for group riding or the tour they're going on. And then you're right, over the course of the year, they might also want to walk their dog every day, these clients. They might want to go on a backpacking trip twice a year, that's completely off, it's related to biking sort of, but now we also have to include some rucking, some hiking in their week with their dog walks, but then also working on the packs and what shoes are we going to wear. So you start getting these other goals incorporated, and we get phases of the year where we're getting ready more for the hiking trip. And then we take another month or two and get ready for the cycling trip. And then all the while, they might be still doing the Saturday group ride and sprinkling bikes and hikes through their week, right? So you can see how that, that's a common example actually for these clients, that there's a bit of hiking in there.
This is why we say cross-training is not a crime.
But it could be BJJ is a common one with these clients that we have. I'm trying to think of other sports that people do. A lot of water sports too, right? Where someone might be, it might not even be cardiovascular sports, right? But they're just into some sort of like wakeboarding or something like that too, right? They could be off a little on this side of things. Downhill skiing is a common one, where you get into phases of the year where they might do a bit of maintenance during the week, and then on the weekends they're actually taking Saturday, Sunday off, quote unquote off, and then that's like really intense downhill skiing where they're great downhill skiers, right? Big mountain skiing, powder. So then we actually have to recover a bit off of that, but usually during the week we can do some of these zone 2 rides, maybe one HIIT workout, maybe 2 strength workouts. conditioning them for the skiing, but also keeping an eye that, say, in the spring, they want to get out and start doing some bike rides or races. Yep. So I don't think it's irregular at all. Like I say, we have a big group of clients that do this, and certainly in the world, there are a lot of people that do this, right? They train for different things they're getting ready for. It just might not be, the races or the bucket list races or anything super extreme. Yeah, which is fine. It's great.
I was gonna say, and I think the big overarching thing is that's okay. That's more than okay. I think, again, social media. We talked about this actually. Well, it won't come out yet. We just talked about it in an intro we were pre-recording, where you look on social media and you do see everyone seems to be at these big, the Leadville, the Unbound, the Big Sugar, the national championships. So many people at those, but I mean, there's so many people. More people don't do any of them. Most people don't. And it's the same in ultra running. We always joke, you're talking to I was actually just interviewing some people, and the woman is like, oh, up until I did, she just done this 100-miler, it didn't go great. And she's like, oh, up until then, I'd only done 100 Ks. And, we're laughing on it because it's just only in this 0.01% of the population would you ever be like, oh, I only do 100 Ks.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, this person, even if they actually said what they do in a week normally,
sure, the
average person would be like, whoa, you're doing all of that? You want to do that bike tour? You want to do that group ride?
Yeah, it's sort of your comparisons, right? I always feel we have friends who, they're great athletes, but then everyone around them is an Olympic caliber athlete, so they look like you're a lazy bum, and it's no, you're actually a really fit person by another standard. If we just shift the frame of reference from Olympic, very privileged people who are exercising every day to the rest of the world, you're actually doing great, right? And it's hard to see that sometimes. Yeah.
And everyone feels that from the person who is, just riding a few times a week and having fun to the very pointy end of the stick. We know so many 100-milers that are still ugh, I don't do 200.
And I hope we've pulled people, our Consummate Athlete, as we started out, it was sort of us exploring other sports and wanting to be able, not in the way that, original CrossFit was be ready for anything. You can't really be ready for anything. But our idea was that, you'd have a lot of skills, you'd try a lot of things, and you'd be able to go to a pickleball thing on, or the pick up baseball and not blow your Achilles tendon, first day out. You wouldn't be the standard 40-year-old male and blow your Achilles tendon. We would have conditioned ourselves. I still can't hit a ball.
I just want to be clear. It's been 7 years and I still cannot do ball sports.
Well, we haven't really worked on it a ton. Pickleball, I still think might be the secret for you, but we'll see. We'll edge into that. But I think that's the idea, is that if you don't pursue a bucket list type, massive ordeal, this can evolve every year of your life. I have clients that don't race for 5 years and then come back and they race, they're really into it and they do Leadville again. They go back at it. They said they were never going back. They decided to go back, which is fantastic. And you can train for 8 months into that and then go back to the normal, go back to wakeboarding and golfing and riding, 3 days a week or something, right? Which is still above what a normal person would do. Getting the strength training back built in there. But I do think that that's when we're back from those super massive things, it does really open up that you can include, for me, it's the running and the strength training. I can include it because my goals in cycling just aren't that big relative to my capacity. And I'm lucky, my capacity in cycling has been built very high. And I've just maintained that, right? But the thing is, once you maintain it and you get to a level, then you can start sprinkling in other things and sort of have these different cycles of the year or periods of the year where you focus a bit more or a bit less.
So all that to say, we're actually kind of thrilled to even be getting a question like this because it means we're actually reaching the people who don't necessarily have the really specific endurance sport goals.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get into the next question, quick word from one of our sponsors, AG1. So when we're talking about just kind of an easy, all-in-one, just get it done supplement, we are both pretty big fans of AG1. It's got your vitamins, your minerals, your probiotics, prebiotics, adaptogens, and of course your greens. Just very simple, 1 scoop in the morning, boom, you're done. I think it's very tasty. I think it's a great way to start the day. It definitely gets me hydrating in the morning, which honestly is a huge thing. And as we were heading into cold and flu season, and travel season, honestly, and holiday season and all of that fun stuff, definitely want to make sure that I'm getting all of that stuff in first thing, just so it's kind of my little new insurance that...
That's right. And it's a subscription, which some people are adverse to. You can cancel it after the first month if you don't like it.
It actually is very easy.
But what I do like about it is that it keeps it coming. You don't have to keep shopping for the next one you're going to get or a different supplement. And so we really like that it sort of says, okay, here's the supplement, you're on it, and now don't think about it anymore, right? Like just stick with it. We really like that as far as like a time and just spending time, in supplement stores. I remember just like walking around them and it's like, you get sent down some random path. So I think it's good just from an attention standpoint. And then we also love the NSF for sport rating.
Yes, which means it has what it says it has in it and nothing else. So that is, super important to us, whether you're an elite athlete or not. I think that certification is just absolutely key.
Now, when people use our link, what's our link again?
Our link is drinkag1.com/MollyH. And you get 5 free travel packs and a year of immune supporting vitamin D. So that's like a droplet form because it is a fat soluble vitamin.
And a great time of year to start onto the vitamin D with the sun being less and less common.
Definitely.
Now we love those. I just went up to the Northwest Territories lead some coaching courses. And, I was able to bring 4 of these Athletic Greens travel packs. I always say they slide nicely into my skinny jeans. So
skinny jeans are out.
Look fashionable as I'm traveling on the plains, and I can have these Athletic Greens with me.
For the Gen Zers, they can fit in the pockets of your cargo pants that are apparently back in trend.
Yes, so you could fit several of them, if not many.
You could actually just put the whole the big monthly,
the whole bag,
whole bag
in each pocket.
Yeah. So again, drinkag1.com/MollyH to take ownership of your health today. Okay, our last question here is the idea of decoupling. So heart rate versus power when your heart rate begins to drift. So, typically when we're talking about training, and again, you can correct me if I get this.
No, I was going to say maybe you just explain it. Maybe we'll be done.
I'll start by explaining it. So when you're training and you're doing, say, an interval that's supposed to be in zone 3, and you're looking at your power and your heart rate on your computer screen. And you're doing zone 3, it's all fine. But then you start noticing that your heart rate is starting to drift up into zone 4, but your power is still staying down in zone 3. This is called decoupling. So what do we do when that's happening? What does it mean when that's happening? Does that mean that we are no longer in the zone? Does it mean the workout is no longer valid? Do we panic? Do we freak out? Do we fall off our bike? What do we do?
Yeah, so Joe Friel, I think, created this idea of decoupling. There's sort of the related idea of efficiency factor, which is sort of dividing the heart rate by the power. Or is it the power by the heart? I always get it mixed up. Anyhow, it gives you a ratio. And both are related. So Molly's, I think, described that well. Your heart rate or your power, one of them stays steady. You decide to hold the power steady, I guess is the example you used. You're in zone 3, so whatever your tempo, Molly's using the 5 or 6 or 7 zone system there. So the tempo zone, you're riding by power. You've decided that power, you're just going to hold at whatever those watts are. And you notice your heart rate's okay. And then it suddenly starts ticking up, after a certain amount of time at that tempo pace. Even though you're holding the power steady, the heart rate is drifting, right? Or decoupling from that heart rate. So it was, say you were doing 150 beats per minute, and then you were at 200 watts for your tempo zone, and then all of a sudden it goes up to 160 beats.
And so to be clear, this is not like, it went up to like 151. Or like 150. You're not talking like one beat out of your zone. Like if it's 1 BPM.
And you're not talking about like a second or 20 seconds. You're talking about, the first 10 minutes, it was 150. The second 10 minutes, it was 150 beats per minute. And then it suddenly is like 160. And you can't, you're like trying to breathe and relax, and you can't get the heart rate down. It's very obviously that like to do that power now, you have seen an increase in the heart rate.
Because obviously, sometimes you hit like a little hill, or you had to like speed up to get around someone, and your heart rate might go up a little bit, and then it should.
But the thing is, your power also went up, so that's not decoupling. That's just you've increased your effort, and so you'll see that with people where it's like, oh, my heart rate went up in the last bit, and it's like, well, did you notice that you probably started working way harder and your power went up? So the ratio So, what Joe Frill's talking about there with efficiency factor, where we divide them, you wouldn't actually see a change. And even in that percentage, difference where it's comparing the first half of the workout to the second half, which is sort of what decoupling shows you when you look at it in Training Peaks or WKO, you wouldn't necessarily see that like a fade. It gives you a percentage fade, basically. So you're going to see this reflected as like 1%, 1.5%, 5%. And where Joe Friel usually has, from all the articles I've ever read, is around 5%. We don't want to see more than 5% fade, you could say, or 5% decoupling or 5% drift. If you start seeing that, then you might end the workout. So that might be a good time. You might do tempo until you see 5%. That would be an effective session, I think. We do a lot of that. Especially for our gravel racers, we'll send them out. I really like to do it on specific terrain if we can, but this could be a trainer workout to start the year, but getting more specific, because the nice thing about riding at this moderate pace is you actually are going pretty quickly relative to yourself. And that pace is pretty specific to a lot of gravel racing, right? So you're going to ride. And again, we were riding at 200 watts, quick. And then you notice, I'm decoupling. And so I would usually actually keep my heart rate stable and let the wattage drop. And then that way the math's a little simpler, because you'll just say, just keep riding till the watts drop 5 or 10%, whatever you want to choose, and then stop. So that is, you're keeping the heart rate at 150, not over 150. And then you were like averaging 200 watts. And then what would be 5% would be 10 watts, I think, in this case, right? So you see 190, and that might be where you're using lap, right? Even if it's a continuous effort, a continuous tempo effort, you might do 10-minute or 20-minute chunks. And so if you notice, I can't hold the power up anymore without the heart rate going up, then I would end the workout. So that would be a pretty good way to use decoupling in your workout. You could decide when you end like a long, moderate interval. Now we should step back. Usually when Joe Friel has described this, it's actually more of like a zone 2 situation. And so you would do like a 3-hour ride, and you would see like, what is your heart rate and how much does it decouple during that ride? And so there again, it would be the exact same idea. You're now in your zone 2 heart rate and your zone 2 power, and then your heart rate might start ticking up to tempo, going over what you might call your aerobic threshold or your top of zone 2 heart rate. And so again, I would control that by heart rate, but you might also then, over the course of months, hope to see less decoupling in your endurance rides, in your zone 2 rides. And so that really is very powerful, because it does show that you're becoming more, you could say durable is sort of like a trendy word, or resilient, or just your endurance, your ability to endure without fading is improving.
Which I think all of these can be like, that's a great goal, kind of coming back to the first question, as far as like, what can a recreational cyclist be working on? Looking at stuff like this is a really great thing to kind of be playing with.
Yep. And that test I mentioned off the bat, where I described it in running, let's put you on your trainer indoors, and you're going to warm up gradually over, say, 15, 20, 30 minutes, depending how fit you are. People who are newer don't need a lot of time, because they can barely pedal without their heart rate going up towards aerobic threshold, right? So they can pretty much just, say 5 minutes of getting rolling, really soft pedaling, and then gradually increase their heart rate up to 75%. If you don't know the max heart rate, this often happens with more recreational folks. That's where the MAF formula to start is really, really nice. It's 180 minus your age. And so just start there, right? A lot of people will protest if they're getting up into the 50s and 60s, but just start there, because we know heart rate is generally linear until you get towards anaerobic threshold or your FTP. You're going to see similar changes. So start there. And if it's stable, if you don't see decoupling, then this is where we can say, okay, we'll just bump it up 5 beats next time, and we could test again and see if you see decoupling. In general, you shouldn't see much decoupling, if you are under that, unless it's going very long, if you're under that aerobic threshold, right? You might see a bit, and certainly a newer person might see more, or a very anaerobic person might see more. Someone who's like a team sports athlete who hasn't done much endurance training might see a bunch of decoupling. But generally, if it's under that heart rate, you wouldn't see a ton, but you do see it. And then again, if you go in endurance train for a while, you should see improvements. If you train more frequently, if this is someone who's never bikes and they bike 3 times a week now, they'll see improvement in this, right? Their ability to pedal a bicycle will improve. But yeah, a great test. So you ride for 30 minutes. I usually like to do 10-minute chunks, even though we're not stopping, we're keeping the pace going. I like to do 10-minute chunks so you can see the change in the average power. But you could just highlight that whole 30-minute chunk in Training Peaks or in WKO, and you could see this decoupling metric that's in Training Peaks. And again, we're just seeing what was the power for the 30 minutes, and then how much did that heart rate drift, or how much change did we see? How much decoupling did we see? And again, that 5% rule is probably good, but I would love to see for something like a 30-minute, I would like to see 2% or less. Especially if the warm-up's really good. That's part of the reason the warm-up has to be very gradual, is you want everything to stabilize, your body to settle in, the temperature to be reasonable, and then just ride, and then it should be pretty stable.
Okay, last question on this is, at what point should someone be rethinking their zones when this is happening? Because I think occasionally, sure. But especially when you're in the higher zones and this is happening, I think it's also a sign that your zones may just not be set correctly.
So I wouldn't generally use it a lot. Even getting to zone 3 again, I don't know. Now we're starting to maybe stretch the idea a little bit. I think you're looking for that same resilience. So I think the metric's probably good. But once you get up in towards threshold, your zones 4 and certainly 5, you wouldn't really use this. You'd expect your body to fall apart and something to break eventually, so to speak, when you're getting into those more like VO2 intervals and threshold intervals. And so there I would focus more just on power and doing the work. But would you increase? So if you just it was super easy riding at that power, then you might look at increasing the zones for sure.
I was thinking more decreasing. If you're constantly finding that when you're at VO2, your heart rate goes above where you thought your VO2 was, or where the heart rate was. So you're riding at your VO2 power and suddenly your heart rate is above the VO2 zone.
Oh.
I think that's generally a sign that your VO2 power actually isn't as good as you think it is, and you probably need to decrease it a tiny bit to actually be within
and maybe
that.
VO2 is a tough one. But I would say for your aerobic, let's again go back down to the bottom. The tough thing with the threshold and the VO2 is you're sort of more on just going hard for the duration. So I would be more, what you would see is you can't finish the workout. The feeling becomes so hard that you can't finish 5 by 3 minutes. And that would be a sign that your threshold setting is too high. So you're trying to hit VO2 intervals that are too hard for you. So that's very common, but I wouldn't necessarily, heart rate probably is just going to be high no matter what there. But the classic is, someone tries to ride their zone 2. I just saw this morning, my zone, this was a zone 2 ride. And it's the average of the ride is well over your zone 2 heart rate. So you were trying to push power that maybe you think is, the classic thing is men want to always ride over 200 watts. But most men, don't have a threshold that indicates that that's a great idea. But they call it a zone 2 ride because they can do it for a couple hours. They can suffer through a couple hours, but that's not the same as doing an endurance ride. It can be fine. I'm not judging you, but if you don't have the threshold to support that, then it is not, by the definition of the system, whatever system you're using, it's not zone 2, right? If you looked at your threshold setting, can you do that power for an extended period of time? And most people, it would be obvious, right? They've never done a 20-minute, even at whatever they have their threshold set. So even though 20-minute is higher, they haven't even done for 20 minutes what they have their threshold set at. And so that's very common where we have these wishful threshold settings. So when in doubt, I would always set your threshold lower than you think. Remembering that probably that good old 60-minute is probably where you'd want to think. But yeah, if you can't ride in your zone 2 power with your heart rate going above, then that's a great sign that you should decrease the power zones.
Perfect. All right, well, let's wrap up there. As usual, hit us up with questions, consummateathlete.com, at consummateathlete on Instagram, ratings, reviews on whatever podcast app you listen to. Super appreciated. And with that, happy training, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.